Alexander Pierce stared out the enormous windows of his office on the 87th floor. He could see the whole city sprawling below, a place that had always felt like his kingdom. But today, everything felt empty. His phone vibrated on his desk, pulling him away from the view. He sighed, moving across the room, and answered. It was Dr. Richardson. "Mr. Pierce, we have the results from your tests." The doctor's voice was steady, but Alexander knew what was coming. He braced himself. "I'm afraid the diagnosis is final. The chances of you conceiving a child naturally are 0. It's irreversible." Alexander gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. "No," he muttered. "There has to be something. Money is not a problem." "I understand, Mr. Pierce, but unfortunately, no amount of money can change these results." The room seemed to close in around Alexander. He felt heat rising up his neck, his pulse pounding in his ears. Without another word, he ended the call. The silence was deafening. He clenched his jaw and grabbed his car keys, storming out of the office. He needed air. He needed space to think. Out on the street, he climbed into his car and hit the gas. The roar of the engine drowned out everything else, but it didn't stop the thoughts from swirling in his mind. Empty thoughts about legacies, family, and the end of everything he'd worked for. The city lights blurred past him. He sped through intersections, not caring about the lights or the honking cars around him. The moment happened fast. He lost control on a bend, the car veered, and before he knew it, everything twisted. He slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The vehicle flipped, glass shattered, metal crunched. Then silence. Alexander was trapped, blood on his forehead, the seatbelt digging into his chest. He could barely breathe. Pain radiated through his body. Suddenly there was movement outside the shattered windshield. A face, female, determined. The door creaked as she pulled at it, and her voice broke through the fog. "Hey, hang on! I'm getting you out!" she shouted. He groaned, barely able to turn his head. Her hands worked quickly. She got the door open, her face straining with effort. She reached in, releasing his seatbelt, and pulled him out with more strength than he'd expected. "You're gonna be okay," she kept saying. He barely registered her words. All he could feel was the cold pavement when she laid him down, the distant blare of an approaching ambulance, and the dark spots clouding his vision until everything faded. When he woke up, the hospital room was quiet. The beeping of machines was steady. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking at the harsh light. A nurse entered, noticing he was awake. "Mr. Pierce, how are you feeling?" she asked, checking his vitals. Where's the woman?" His voice was raspy. He wasn't even sure how long he'd been out. The nurse gave him a curious look. "You mean the woman who pulled you out of the car? She left after the ambulance arrived. Didn't want anything in return, just wanted to make sure you were okay." Alexander frowned. "No reward?" "She said no, sir. Didn't even leave her name." That didn't make sense. Everyone wanted something. But this woman, she risked her life for him and didn't even stick around for a thank you. Alexander leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, her face flashing in his memory. Why had she done it? A week later, Alexander was discharged. He was healing, but something about that night kept gnawing at him. He couldn't let it go. He had to find her, the woman who pulled him out of his car. He had resources. It shouldn't have been hard. It took only 2 days for his team to track her down. Karen Morrison, a teacher in a public school in the Bronx. Alexander drove there, stepping out of his sleek black sedan into the bustling neighborhood. He was out of place, the polished shoes and tailored suit a stark contrast to the surroundings. The school building was old, the paint peeling off in places. Kids were playing outside, their laughter filling the air. He walked up to the entrance and saw her. She was crouched down, helping a kid tie their shoelace. Her hair was tied back and she looked tired but happy. "Miss Morrison?" Alexander called out. Karen stood up, turning to face him. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Pierce, what are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. I wanted to thank you. You saved my life." She waved a hand, almost dismissively. "You don't have to thank me. Anyone would have done it." "No," he said, stepping closer. "No, they wouldn't. I tried to find you because I owe you something." She shook her head, smiling, but it wasn't condescending. It was tired, genuine. "Mr. Pierce, you don't owe me anything. I just did what was right." He paused, staring at her, unsure of how to respond. People never refused him, never dismissed his offers. But here she was, standing in front of him, acting like his wealth meant nothing. "At least let me take you out to dinner, please. It's just a thank you." Karen hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, studying him. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, dinner, but nothing fancy." Alexander smiled, relieved. "Deal." He didn't know why he felt so drawn to her. Maybe it was because she seemed untouched by his world, by the greed, the power. Maybe it was because she'd done what no one else had. She saved him without asking for anything in return. And maybe, just maybe, that was what he needed more than anything else right now. Alexander pulled up outside the school again, this time in a more understated car. He had taken Karen's words seriously, nothing fancy. The black SUV was far from the usual stretch limousine or sports car, but it still turned a few heads. He leaned against the vehicle, glancing at the school doors, and watched as children and teachers filtered out at the end of the day. Finally, he spotted her. Karen Morrison, dressed in a simple green jacket, her bag slung over her shoulder, looking tired but determined as always. She was busy talking to a parent, nodding along and reassuring them about their child's progress. When she noticed Alexander, her eyebrows shot up slightly, and she wrapped up the conversation quickly. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't think you'd actually show up," she said, approaching him with a mix of surprise and skepticism in her voice. He smiled, opening the passenger door. "I said I'd take you to dinner. I keep my promises." She looked at the car, then back at him. "You really didn't have to do this, you know." Alexander shrugged, trying to keep it casual. "It's just dinner." Karen sighed, clearly reluctant, but eventually stepped forward, sliding into the passenger seat. Alexander walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. They drove in silence for a while, the car moving smoothly through the crowded streets of the Bronx. He stole a glance at her, noticing how she seemed more comfortable in her own world, her eyes scanning the familiar streets. He broke the silence first. "I hope you like Italian. I found a place nearby, nothing too much, I hope," she interrupted, a teasing edge to her voice. He grinned, shaking his head. "No, nothing over the top, I promise." They pulled up to a small, family-run Italian restaurant on the corner of the street. Karen looked pleasantly surprised. "All right, this is actually nice," she said, stepping out. "Not bad, Mr. Pierce." They entered the restaurant, the warm smell of garlic and tomato sauce welcoming them. The place was cozy, a few people seated at mismatched tables, soft chatter filling the room. A hostess greeted them and led them to a corner booth. Alexander noticed how Karen relaxed almost immediately as they settled in. "So," Karen began, picking up the menu. "Why the interest in me, Mr. Pierce?" Alexander put down his own menu, leaning back in his seat. "Call me Alexander," he corrected, "and I'm interested because you saved my life." She met his eyes, her expression serious. "You could have sent a thank you card, or a fruit basket." He smiled, but it was a little strained. "I suppose I could have, but honestly I wanted to see for myself why you did it, why you turned down the money." Karen sighed, shaking her head. "Not everything is about money, you know." Alexander paused, watching her. It wasn't something he'd ever thought about before. His whole life, everything had been about money, earning it, spending it, using it to solve problems. But here was Karen, someone who clearly had financial struggles, who could have taken his offer and still said no. It baffled him. The waitress approached, and they ordered their meals. Karen went for a simple pasta dish, while Alexander chose the special. When the waitress left, Karen looked at him again, her eyes softer now. "Look, I don't mean to sound ungrateful. I'm glad you're okay, really, but I don't want anything from you. I just want to go on with my life." Alexander nodded, trying to understand her perspective. "And what is your life like?" he asked, genuinely curious. Karen shrugged. "It's simple. I teach. I try to make a difference for these kids. I don't have much, but I don't need much either." He found himself fascinated by her honesty. There was no pretense. She was who she was, and that was enough for her. The conversation shifted after that. They talked about her students, the challenges they faced, the joy she got from teaching. Alexander listened, and for once, He didn't feel the need to steer the conversation towards himself. Their food arrived, and they continued talking as they ate. Alexander told her a little about his business, though he noticed her eyes glazing over when he spoke about financial strategies and corporate maneuvers. Instead, he steered the conversation towards the things they both enjoyed: books, movies, travel. He learned that Karen loved hiking, that she often escaped the city on weekends to find a quiet trail to walk. As they finished their meal, Karen leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "Okay, I'll admit it. This was actually pretty nice." Alexander smiled. "I'm glad you think so." They stepped out of the restaurant and Karen glanced at the car. "You know, you really don't have to drive me home. I can take the subway." "No chance," Alexander replied quickly. "I'm seeing you home." She sighed, but there was no real resistance. They got in the car, and he started the drive back to her apartment. The streets were quieter now, the evening settling in. He noticed how she relaxed further as they approached her neighborhood, her home, her comfort zone. When they pulled up outside her building, Karen turned to him. "Thank you, Alexander, for dinner, and for, actually listening." He nodded, appreciating the warmth in her voice. "Of course, and I'd like to do this again, if you're okay with it." She hesitated, her eyes studying him, as if she was searching for something. Finally, she smiled. "We'll see. Good night, Alexander." He watched her until she disappeared into her building, her silhouette fading. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was something about Karen that made him feel alive in a way his business world never had. She was real, grounded, and he found himself wanting to be a part of that world, even if it meant stepping far outside of his own comfort. As he drove away, he didn't feel the usual emptiness that often followed his interactions. Instead, there was something else, a feeling he couldn't quite name, but one he hoped would bring him back to her door. Alexander found himself returning to the Bronx again, despite the lingering looks from his chauffeur and the puzzled reactions from his personal assistant. There was something about Karen that drew him in, something genuine that he hadn't felt in his life for a long time. He decided it wasn't enough to simply thank her once and leave it at that. He wanted to see her again, to be part of her life in a way that mattered. This time, he took the liberty of bringing a few books for her students, science kits, fiction for young readers, and even some art supplies. They were simple things, but things he thought would fit the world Karen described. He knew he was stepping into her space without asking, but a part of him hoped it would help bridge the gap between their two different realities. When he arrived at the school, he waited in the car until he spotted her again, leaving the building with the same determined stride. He stepped out, calling her name. "Karen!" He waved, holding a bag full of the books and supplies. She turned, her eyes narrowing as she recognized him. There was a moment of pause, a guarded expression crossing her face. She walked over, her eyes shifting between him and the bag he was holding. "Alexander?" she asked, clearly surprised to see him again. "What are you doing here?" He smiled, holding up the bag. "I brought a few things for your class. I thought maybe it could help." She stared at the bag, then at him, and he could see her lips pressing into a thin line, her gaze hardening. "Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you can't just buy your way into everything, Alexander," she said, her voice low but firm. He blinked, taken aback. I just wanted to help." "I get that," she said, sighing, her expression softening slightly. "But you have to understand, my world doesn't work the way yours does. People here aren't used to things being handed to them." He hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had always thought that giving was a good thing, but now, standing there with Karen, he realized how out of touch he was with the way people like her lived. People who didn't have everything handed to them, people who worked hard for what they had. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't mean to overstep." Karen nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know you didn't. It's just complicated. You can't fix everything with money." There was an awkward silence between them, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Karen looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But since you're here," she said, her voice a little lighter, "why don't you come with me? I'm heading to the park. You can help me with some of the kids I'm working with after school." Alexander felt a rush of relief. "I'd like that," he said. She led him down the street, towards a small park with a worn-out playground and a basketball court that looked like it had seen better days. A group of kids were already there, playing and running around. Karen waved to them, and they ran over, excitedly pulling her towards the court. "Guys, this is Mr. Alexander," she said, introducing him to the kids. "He's going to help us today." The kids looked at him, curious but a little wary. Alexander smiled, kneeling down to their level. "Hey, I'm just here to help Miss Morrison. What are we doing today?" One of the kids, a young boy with a mischievous grin, pointed towards a stack of old basketballs. "We're gonna play, but Miss Morrison's team always loses." Karen rolled her eyes, laughing. All right, let's split up then." They spent the next hour playing basketball, running drills and cheering as the kids tried to make baskets. Alexander felt strangely out of place at first, unsure of how to act around the children. But as the game went on, he found himself getting caught up in their energy, laughing along with them and forgetting for a moment about his own world. Karen watched him, her eyes softening as she saw him interacting with the kids. For someone who had always been about business and efficiency, Alexander seemed to genuinely care, even if he was still a little awkward. She appreciated his effort, even if he didn't quite understand everything yet. After the game, they sat on a bench while the kids ran off to play on the swings. Karen handed him a water bottle, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "you don't have to keep trying so hard. Just being here, being part of this, that's enough." Alexander looked at her, his brow furrowed. I want to do something that actually matters. Not just money, but something real." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Then just be here. Show up. That's all that matters to them." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the kids play. Alexander felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about deals or negotiations. It was just about being there, being present. Karen stood up after a while, brushing off her jeans. "I should get going. These kids' parents will be here soon." Alexander nodded, standing as well. "Can I walk you home?" She paused, looking at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But remember, no fancy cars next time," she said, giving him a teasing smile. He laughed. "I'll keep that in mind." They walked in silence, the sun setting over the buildings, the streetlights flickering on as the city began to wind down for the night. When they reached her building, Karen turned to face him, her hands in her pockets. "Thanks for coming today," she said. "I think the kids liked having you there." "I like being there," he replied honestly, "and I'd like to do it again, if you'll let me." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she smiled. "We'll see. Good night, Alexander." He watched as she disappeared into her building, a strange warmth spreading through him. He knew there was still a long way to go, still so much he didn't understand. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. A week later, Alexander found himself outside Karen's school once again. He'd been trying to think of how to make his next step right. No grand gestures, no checkbook solutions. Just him being there, hoping that maybe he could continue to bridge the gap between their worlds. As he leaned against his SUV, he saw her emerge from the building, the same weary yet determined look on her face. She noticed him instantly, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "You're back," she said, approaching. Her tone was warm, with a hint of curiosity. "No gifts this time, I hope?" she smirked, teasing. Alexander laughed, holding his hands up. "Just me. No strings attached." Karen smiled, nodding approvingly. "All right then, just you." They walked together, heading towards the park again. As they made their way through the streets of the Bronx, Alexander noticed how different this world felt from his. The buildings were older, worn. People sat on their stoops talking, watching the world pass by. He felt out of place, a feeling that wasn't entirely comfortable. "Still getting used to it?" Karen asked, noticing his wandering gaze. He nodded, not wanting to lie. "Yeah, it's different," Karen smiled. "Different isn't always bad, Alexander. Sometimes it just takes time to understand." They reached the park, and the kids were already there, shouting and playing. A few of them spotted Karen and ran over, their faces lighting up when they saw Alexander as well. "Mr. Alexander's back," one of them yelled, and soon they were all gathered around him, tugging at his sleeves, asking if he was going to play again. He laughed, kneeling down to their level. All right, I guess I have no choice." They spent the next hour playing, Karen directing the activities while Alexander helped out. He found himself laughing more than he had in a long time, caught up in the simple joy of the kids' excitement. But as the hour drew on, he noticed a few people watching from the edges of the park. Men in suits with cameras. His smile faltered. Karen noticed too. She followed his gaze and her face fell. "Media," she muttered, her voice tense. Alexander sighed, standing up straighter. "I'm sorry, Karen. I didn't think—" "No, of course you didn't," she cut him off, her tone sharp. She looked away, her jaw clenched. "This is exactly what I didn't want." Alexander stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let me handle it. I can make them leave." She shook her head, her eyes filled with frustration. "That's not the point, Alexander. They shouldn't be here in the first place. This is my life. These are my kids, my students. They don't deserve this kind of attention." He opened his mouth to argue, but she turned away, calling the kids together. "All right, everyone, time to wrap it up," she shouted, her voice strained but steady. The children groaned, but they listened, slowly gathering their things and heading off to their parents, who were starting to arrive. Karen didn't look at Alexander as she spoke to each parent, reassuring them and making small talk. He could feel the distance growing between them, a wall that felt impossible to climb. When the last child left, Karen turned to him, her arms crossed over her chest. "You need to understand something, Alexander. My life isn't yours to fix. I don't need the media attention, I don't need your money, and I don't need you showing up here if it's going to put these kids at risk." He felt his chest tighten, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "Karen, I'm trying to be part of this, to understand." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "I know you're trying, but you have to realize that your world brings complications mine can't handle. The media, the attention, it's too much." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll make sure they don't come back. I'll be more careful." She sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing a little. "I just need some space, all right? To figure this out, to figure us out." Alexander nodded again, the ache in his chest not easing. "Okay, I understand." Karen gave him a sad smile. "I'll call you when I'm ready. But for now, maybe it's best if you stay away for a bit." He watched her turn and walk away, disappearing down the street. He stood there, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He wanted to help. He wanted to be part of her world. But it was clear now that his presence brought complications that she didn't need, didn't want. And the last thing he wanted was to make her life harder. The following days were quiet. Alexander stayed away just as Karen had asked. He tried to focus on his work, on the meetings, the deals, the endless stream of numbers and negotiations. But his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept drifting back to Karen, to the park, to the kids. He missed it. He missed her. One night, he sat alone in his penthouse, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His phone sat on the table beside him, Karen's number at the top of his call list. He wanted to reach out, to apologize again, to tell her that he would do whatever it took to be part of her life. But he knew she needed space, and he respected that. The silence of his apartment felt heavier now, the emptiness more pronounced. He had always been comfortable alone, always preferred his own company to that of others. But now, for the first time, he found himself wanting something more, someone more. A week passed, then two. He kept his distance, waiting, hoping she would reach out. And then one day his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw her name. "Karen, complications, hospital. Can you come?" He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, rushing out of his apartment and into his car. He drove through the city, his heart pounding in his chest. She was at the hospital. Complications. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. He had to get to her. He had to be there. When he arrived at the hospital, he rushed to the front desk, asking for her. The nurse directed him to the maternity ward, and he sprinted down the hallway, his chest tight with fear. He found her room, the door slightly ajar. He paused, catching his breath before stepping inside. Karen was lying in bed, her face pale, her eyes closed. A nurse was adjusting her IV, and she looked up as he entered. "Are you family?" the nurse asked. Alexander nodded without hesitation. "Yes." The nurse gave him a sympathetic smile. "She's stable now, but it was close. She'll need rest." He moved closer, his heart aching as he looked at her. She looked so fragile, so unlike the strong, determined woman he knew. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him, her lips curving into a weak smile. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, Karen. I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm scared, Alexander. I don't want to do this alone." He squeezed her hand, leaning closer. "You're not alone. I'm here. I'll be here every step of the way." She nodded, her hand tightening around his. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, right there beside her, ready to face whatever came next. Alexander spent that entire night in the hospital room beside Karen, holding her hand while machines beeped softly around them. He didn't leave her side, even as nurses came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting her medications. The worry etched on his face grew with every hour. Karen's complexion remained pale, her breathing labored. The atmosphere was tense, a delicate balance between hope and fear. Around dawn, Karen began to stir. She blinked slowly, her eyes focusing on Alexander. He leaned closer, his face softening when she met his eyes. "Hey," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "How are you feeling?" She gave a tired smile, her voice weak. "Better, I think. I didn't expect to see you, honestly." Alexander squeezed her hand lightly. "You texted. Of course I came. I told you I'm here for you. I meant it." Karen looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She didn't say anything, but her lips parted, and her expression softened. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a doctor walked in, carrying a chart. "Miss Morrison," he said, nodding at her and then at Alexander. "I'm Dr. Patel. We need to discuss some important details about your condition." Karen swallowed, nodding as she turned her attention to the doctor. Alexander moved closer to her, a silent show of support. "The situation is critical," Dr. Patel began, looking at them both. "The babies are under distress, and it's becoming unsafe to continue the pregnancy. We need to perform an emergency C-section." Karen's face blanched. She looked at Alexander, her fear evident in her eyes. He felt his stomach drop, his hand instinctively tightening around hers. "Is it dangerous?" Karen asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Patel's expression was kind but serious. "There are risks, yes, but at this point, it's the safest option for you and the babies." Karen closed her eyes, her breathing shaky. Alexander could see the struggle on her face, the fear, the uncertainty. He leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm here, Karen. You're not alone in this. You can do this, and I'll be right here, every step of the way." She looked up at him, her eyes wet with tears, and nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The doctor nodded and quickly left the room to prepare. Within minutes, the medical team began to move in, prepping Karen for the surgery. Alexander was told he couldn't be in the operating room, and it took all of his self-control to let go of her hand as they wheeled her away. He watched them disappear down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt helpless, utterly helpless in a way he never had before. Money, power, influence, none of it mattered in this moment. All he could do was wait and hope. Alexander paced the waiting room, his steps quick and agitated. The minutes felt like hours. He couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming worry that gripped him. He stared at the double doors that led to the operating room, waiting for any sign, any news. Eventually, a nurse came through, her expression tired but calm. She approached him, her eyes kind. "Mr. Pierce?" He spun around, his eyes wide. "How is she? How are the babies?" The nurse smiled softly. "The surgery went as expected. Miss Morrison is stable and in recovery. The babies were born prematurely, but they're both alive. They're in the neonatal intensive care unit now." Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief flooded his entire being, and he felt his knees go weak. "Can I see them? Can I see her?" The nurse nodded. "You can see Miss Morrison now. She's still waking up, but she's asking for you." He followed the nurse through the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. When they reached Karen's room, he paused for a moment at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Karen was lying in bed, her face pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. But when she saw Alexander, she smiled, a tired but genuine smile. He moved to her side, taking her hand gently. "You did it," he said softly. "You and the babies are safe. You're incredible, Karen." She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How are they?" she whispered. "They're in the NICU. The nurse said they're fighting, just like you." Karen opened her eyes, looking at him. "I want to see them," she said, her voice trembling. Alexander nodded. "I'll make sure of it." Hours later, after Karen had rested, a nurse wheeled her to the NICU. Alexander walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The room was quiet, the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of machines creating an atmosphere of fragility. The incubators were lined up, each one a small, protected world of its own. The nurse led them to 2 incubators side by side. Karen leaned forward, tears filling her eyes as she looked at the tiny forms of her babies, each one wrapped in soft blankets, tubes and wires surrounding them. "They're so small," she whispered, her voice breaking. Alexander felt his own throat tighten as he looked at the babies. His heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't quite describe. They were so tiny, so vulnerable, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Karen reached out, her hand shaking as she touched the glass of the incubator. "They're beautiful," she said, her tears falling freely now. "They are," Alexander agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He put his arm around Karen, holding her as she cried, feeling the weight of everything they had been through settle over them. For the next several days, Alexander barely left the hospital. He stayed by Karen's side, helping her as she recovered, visiting the babies in the NICU together. He watched as Karen spoke to them softly, her voice filled with love, her hands gentle as she touched their tiny bodies through the incubator walls. He found himself falling in love with these babies, not because of some obligation, but because they were a part of Karen, and because they represented a future that he wanted to be a part of. He realized, watching them, that his definition of family was changing. It wasn't about blood or lineage. It was about love, about the choices they made, about being there for the people who mattered. One afternoon, as Karen was resting, Alexander stood by the NICU, watching the babies through the glass. A nurse approached him, her smile kind. "Are you the father?" she asked. Alexander paused, the question catching him off guard. He looked at the tiny forms in the incubators, their little chests rising and falling with each breath. He thought about Karen, about the journey they had been through together, about the promises he had made. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady. "Yes, I am." The nurse nodded, her smile widening. "They're fighters, just like their mom." Alexander looked at the babies, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and love. "Yeah," he said softly, "they are." Days passed and slowly things began to stabilize. The babies grew stronger, their tiny bodies gaining weight, their breathing becoming more regular. Karen's health improved too, her color returning, her energy slowly coming back. One day, as they sat together by the incubators, Karen turned to Alexander, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said, her voice shaky. Alexander took her hand, his gaze steady on hers. "You never have to find out. I'm here, Karen, for you and for them, whatever it takes." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm scared, Alexander. I've never felt so scared in my life." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know, but you're not alone. We're in this together." She looked at him, her lips trembling. "Do you mean that? Truly?" He nodded, his voice filled with conviction. "With all my heart." Karen let out a shaky breath, her tears spilling over. She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle beeping of the NICU, the soft breaths of their children, Alexander realized that this was what he had been searching for all his life. Not power, not money, not legacy, but love. Real, genuine, imperfect love. And he knew without a doubt, that he would do whatever it took to protect it. Alexander sat in the NICU next to Karen, watching as a nurse gently removed one of the babies from the incubator. The nurse placed the tiny girl into Karen's arms, her face lighting up with a soft smile. Karen looked down, her expression filled with a mix of awe and exhaustion. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her, or the small bundle she held. "This is Rose," Karen whispered, her eyes never leaving the baby. Alexander nodded, stepping closer, his heart tightening at the sight. She was so small, her eyes barely open, her tiny fingers curled against Karen's shirt. "And this is Lily," the nurse said, approaching with the other baby. She looked at Alexander, raising her eyebrows slightly. "Would you like to hold her?" He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. Then nodding, he took the baby carefully into his arms. She was lighter than anything he'd ever held, her warmth seeping into his chest, her little face scrunched up, her mouth opening in a silent yawn. Alexander felt a smile pull at his lips. "Hi, Lily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The baby shifted slightly, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment, then closing again. He looked up at Karen, who was watching him, her eyes filled with tears. "They're perfect," she said, her voice trembling. Alexander nodded, swallowing hard. "They really are." After another week in the NICU, the day finally came for Rose and Lily to be discharged. Karen had been preparing, nervous and excited, unsure of what to expect. Alexander had made arrangements to bring them all home, the back seat of his car now equipped with 2 infant car seats. He insisted on making things comfortable, despite Karen's initial resistance. As they left the hospital, Karen held one of the babies, while Alexander carried the other. The air was cool, and the city was bustling around them, unaware of the small miracle they carried. Alexander opened the car door, carefully securing Rose in her car seat before helping Karen with Lily. He moved with a gentleness that seemed so at odds with the way he usually carried himself. Once they were all inside, Karen looked over at Alexander, her eyes tired but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Alexander. Really. I don't think I could have done any of this without you." He turned to look at her, his eyes sincere. "I meant what I said, Karen. I'm here, for you and for them, always." She nodded, her lips curving into a soft smile. "I believe you." The drive was quiet, both of them too focused on the tiny sounds coming from the back seat. The gentle sighs and breaths of the babies filled the car, and Alexander found himself glancing back every few minutes, his heart swelling each time. When they finally pulled up to Karen's apartment building, Alexander got out, moving quickly to help her. He carried Lily while Karen took Rose, and they made their way inside, up the narrow stairway to her small apartment. The space was modest, but it was home, and Karen felt a sense of relief as they stepped inside. Alexander set Lily down in a small bassinet Karen had bought, his gaze sweeping over the apartment. It was cluttered, filled with books, clothes, and all the other things that come with a busy life. He looked back at Karen, a hesitant smile on his face. "I know this isn't a lot," she said, her voice tinged with embarrassment. Alexander shook his head, stepping closer. "It's perfect. It's home." Karen smiled, her eyes softening. She moved to set Rose in the bassinet beside her sister, then turned to face Alexander. "I guess this is it, huh? The real challenge." He nodded, his expression serious. "It is, but we'll get through it, together." They spent the next few hours getting settled, Karen showing Alexander where everything was, how to prepare the formula, and the best way to calm the babies when they cried. He listened carefully, taking mental notes, his usual confidence replaced by something more cautious, more deliberate. Later that evening, after the babies were fed and asleep, Karen and Alexander sat on the small couch in the living room. The exhaustion was evident on both their faces, but there was a sense of peace as well, of accomplishment. "You know," Karen said, leaning her head back against the couch, "I used to think I had to do everything on my own. After my fiancé passed, I thought I couldn't trust anyone to be there for me." Alexander looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Karen, you're not alone anymore. I know it's not easy to trust, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes meeting his. "I believe you, Alexander, and I want you to be part of their lives. I can't do this alone, and I don't want to." He reached over, taking her hand in his. "I'll be here, every step of the way." They sat there, holding hands, the soft sound of the babies breathing in the next room. There were still so many challenges ahead, so many things to figure out. But in that moment, they were together, and that was enough. The following week was a whirlwind. Sleepless nights, diaper changes, feedings every few hours. It was more work than Alexander had ever imagined. He moved into the spare room in Karen's apartment, despite her initial protests. The space was tight, but he insisted. He wanted to be there, truly be there for every moment. He found himself falling into a routine, waking up to help with feedings, running errands for Karen when she needed things, holding Rose and Lily when Karen needed rest. It was exhausting, but it was also the most fulfilling thing he had ever done. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Karen looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and affection. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day where Alexander Pierce, the billionaire, was changing diapers and warming bottles." Alexander laughed softly, shaking his head. "Honestly, I never thought I'd see that day either, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." Karen smiled, her eyes softening. "You're really doing this, aren't you? You're really part of this now." He nodded, his expression serious. "I am, and I wouldn't have it any other way." They sat there, a comfortable silence settling between them. The babies were asleep, the apartment quiet for the first time in what felt like days. Alexander looked over at Karen, his heart swelling with a warmth he had never felt before. "I was thinking," he began, his voice hesitant. "Maybe we should look for a bigger place, somewhere with more room for you, for the girls, for us." Karen looked at him, her eyes widening slightly. "Alexander, I don't know. That's a big step." He nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "I know it is, but I want to do this right. I want to give you and the girls everything you need." She looked down, her brow furrowed in thought. I don't want to feel like I'm depending on you for everything." "You're not," he said softly. "We're partners, Karen. This isn't about charity. It's about building a life together, a real life." Karen looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. I want to do what's best for Rose and Lily." "So do I," Alexander said, his voice filled with conviction. "And I think this is the right step. For all of us." She nodded slowly, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Okay, let's do it. Let's look for a place." Alexander's heart soared at her words. He leaned over, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Thank you, Karen. I promise I'll make this work." She hugged him back, her eyes closing as she rested her head against his shoulder. "I know you will." And in that moment, Alexander knew that this was the beginning of something real, something worth fighting for. He had spent his whole life chasing success, chasing power. But now, he had something far more valuable. He had a family, and he was determined to protect it, no matter what. 3 weeks later, Karen, Alexander, and the twins found themselves standing outside a beautiful townhouse on a quiet street. The building was red brick, with a small front garden and windows that looked clean and welcoming. Alexander held Lily in his arms while Karen held Rose, and they exchanged a look of excitement mixed with nervousness. "This is it," Alexander said, his voice filled with a hint of pride. He opened the gate, letting Karen step through first. The real estate agent had already unlocked the door and was waiting for them inside. She greeted them with a polite smile as they entered, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the babies. "Mr. Pierce, Miss Morrison," she said, nodding to each of them. "Please take a look around. The place has 4 bedrooms, an updated kitchen, and plenty of natural light." Karen stepped into the living room, her eyes widening as she looked around. It was spacious, with big windows that let in the afternoon sun. She could see herself living here, could see Rose and Lily taking their first steps on the hardwood floor, could imagine them playing in the backyard that she could glimpse through the sliding glass door. Alexander stayed quiet, watching her as she moved from room to room. He saw the way her eyes lit up, the way she carefully peeked into each bedroom, her gaze softening when she looked at what could be the twins' room. It was the kind of expression that made his heart swell, an expression that spoke of hope, of new beginnings. "Well?" he asked, his voice gentle. "What do you think?" Karen turned to face him, her eyes filled with emotion. "It's beautiful, Alexander, but I just don't know if we're ready for this. It feels like such a big change." Alexander took a step closer, his voice soft but steady. "Karen, I know it's a big step, but I want you to feel comfortable. I want you and the girls to have a place that feels like home, and I want us to do this together." She looked at him, her brow furrowed in thought. She opened her mouth, ready to argue, but then she paused, looking down at Rose, who was dozing peacefully in her arms. She could picture her daughters growing up here, in a place that was safe, that had enough space for them to live and play, and she realized that maybe it was time to take that leap of faith. "Okay," she said finally, her voice shaky. "Let's do it." Alexander's face broke into a smile, relief flooding through him. "Yeah?" Karen nodded, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Yeah." 2 months later, they moved into the townhouse. It was chaotic, with boxes everywhere and the babies crying every few hours. But through the mess, there was a sense of joy, a sense that they were building something new together. Alexander had hired movers, but he insisted on helping, carrying boxes into the house and unpacking as much as he could. Karen watched him, her heart swelling with affection. He had changed so much, had become someone who was willing to get his hands dirty, to do the hard work that came with being a family. That first night in the townhouse, they sat together in the living room, surrounded by unpacked boxes, the twins finally asleep in their new cribs. The room was dim, lit only by a few lamps they had managed to plug in. Karen leaned back on the couch, her head resting on Alexander's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "This is really happening, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft. Alexander smiled, his arm wrapping around her. "Yeah, it is." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and vulnerability. "Do you think we can do this? Raise them, I mean. Be a real family." Alexander looked down at her, his gaze steady. "I know we can. I want this, Karen. I want you and Rose and Lily, more than anything." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She leaned up, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. "I want that too." Alexander held her close, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so certain about anything in his life, and in that moment, he knew what he needed to do next. The following week, Alexander planned a simple evening for the two of them. He arranged for a babysitter, a kind older woman from the neighborhood, to look after Rose and Lily for a few hours, and he took Karen out to dinner. It wasn't a fancy restaurant, just a quiet little Italian place that Karen loved, the same one they had gone to on their first proper dinner together. Karen looked beautiful, her hair pulled back, a simple dress that flowed around her as she moved. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her, his heart swelling with love and nervousness. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now, sitting across from her, his palms were sweaty, and his mind felt blank. "Alexander?" Karen asked, her brow furrowed slightly. "You seem distracted." He took a deep breath, reaching across the table to take her hand. "There's something I need to say," he began, his voice shaky. "Something I've been wanting to say for a while now." Karen blinked, her eyes widening slightly. "Okay," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. Alexander cleared his throat, trying to calm his nerves. "Karen, these past few months have been the best of my life. You and the girls, you've given me something I never thought I could have. A family, a real family, and I want to make it official." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring. Karen gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in surprise. "Karen Morrison," Alexander said, his voice filled with emotion. "Will you marry me? Not because it's the right thing to do, or because of the girls, but because I love you. I love you more than anything, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Tears filled Karen's eyes, her lips trembling as she looked at the ring, then back at Alexander. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you." Alexander's face broke into a smile, tears welling up in his own eyes. He stood, moving around the table, pulling her into a gentle hug. Karen wrapped her arms around him, her tears spilling over as she buried her face in his chest. The rest of the restaurant clapped, a few people cheering as they pulled away, Alexander slipping the ring onto her finger. Karen looked at it, her hand shaking slightly, her heart swelling with love and joy. "I love you," she whispered, looking up at him. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Alexander said, his voice filled with emotion. When they got back home that night, Karen and Alexander found the twins fast asleep in their cribs, the babysitter smiling at them as she gathered her things to leave. After thanking her and seeing her out, Alexander and Karen stood together, watching Rose and Lily sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling with each breath. Karen looked up at Alexander, her eyes filled with love. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" she whispered. Alexander nodded, his arm wrapping around her waist. "Yeah, we are." Karen leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with hope. She knew there would be challenges ahead, difficult moments, times when they would struggle. But she also knew that they had something real, something worth fighting for. And that was enough. The next morning, they shared the news with the world, or at least with their small part of it. Karen's friends from the school, the neighbors, even some of Alexander's colleagues, all of them were thrilled for the couple. Charlotte, Alexander's sister, was a little more reserved, but eventually even she offered her congratulations, a small smile on her face as she hugged her brother. "You've changed, Alex," she said quietly, "and I think it's for the better." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's because of them," he said simply. "They make me better." Charlotte smiled, her eyes softening. "I'm happy for you truly. I can't wait to meet my nieces." And just like that, Alexander felt a sense of completeness he had never imagined. He had a family, a real family. And as he stood there, watching Karen hold Rose and Lily, his heart swelled with love and hope for the future. Because for the first time in his life, he had everything he had ever wanted, and he was determined to hold on to it. 2 months after the engagement, life had settled into a new rhythm for Alexander, Karen, and the twins. Their new home felt increasingly like theirs. They had painted the nursery, added small decorations, and filled the rooms with toys, books, and the unmistakable energy of 2 growing babies. Alexander marveled at how effortlessly Karen had turned this townhouse into a real home, one filled with warmth and love. But Alexander felt there was still something left unfinished. He knew the next step was to officially become a father to Rose and Lily. He wanted it for himself, but more than that, he wanted it for them. He wanted them to know that he was there permanently, that his commitment wasn't just a promise but something tangible, something real. One evening, after they had put the twins to sleep, Alexander sat down with Karen in the living room. He had been nervous all day, trying to find the right words, the right time, and now, with the soft light of the lamp casting a warm glow, he knew it was the perfect moment. "Karen," he began, his voice hesitant, "there's something I want to talk to you about." She looked at him, tilting her head slightly, her eyes curious. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle. Alexander took a deep breath, reaching out to take her hand in his. "I want to adopt Rose and Lily," he said, his voice firm. "I want to be their father officially, not just because I'm marrying you, but because I love them as if they were my own." Karen's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at their joined hands, her eyes welling up with tears. She took a moment before speaking, her voice shaky. "Alexander," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "Do you really mean that? Are you sure?" He nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "More than anything, I want to be their father. I want them to grow up knowing that I'm here for them no matter what. I want to give them my name, to make sure they always know they belong." Karen's tears spilled over, her lips trembling. She reached up, cupping his cheek with her free hand. "I love you so much," she said, her voice breaking. "And I think that would be amazing, for them and for us." Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with love and relief. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for trusting me, for letting me be part of their lives." The process of adoption wasn't easy, but Alexander was determined. They met with lawyers, filled out endless paperwork, and attended meetings to ensure that everything was done properly. Alexander found himself feeling more nervous than he had in any boardroom or negotiation. This was real, this was his family, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Karen stood by his side through it all, her presence a calming influence. She watched as Alexander navigated the complexities of the adoption process, her heart swelling with love and admiration for the man he had become. He was no longer just the billionaire she had saved. He was her partner, her rock, the father to her daughters. Months passed, and finally the day came. They were scheduled to appear in family court for the official hearing. Karen dressed the twins in matching white dresses, their tiny shoes barely staying on their wiggling feet. Alexander wore a simple suit, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made Karen smile. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice soft as they stood outside the courtroom. Alexander looked down at the twins, who were both looking around, their eyes wide and curious. He smiled, his nerves settling as he looked at them. "More than ready," he said, his voice filled with conviction. They entered the courtroom, the judge sitting at the bench, a kind smile on her face as she looked at the family in front of her. The proceedings began, the lawyer explaining the situation, the reasons for the adoption. Alexander held Karen's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the judge looked at Alexander, her eyes softening. "Mr. Pierce, do you understand the responsibilities of adopting these children?" she asked. "Do you understand that by adopting Rose and Lily, you're assuming all the duties of a father, legally and emotionally?" Alexander nodded, his voice steady as he spoke. "I do, Your Honor. I love these girls, and I want nothing more than to be their father, to protect them, to care for them, to be there for them every day of their lives." The judge smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Very well. It is my pleasure to grant the adoption of Rose and Lily Morrison to Mr. Alexander Pierce. Congratulations." Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears filling her eyes. Alexander squeezed her hand, his own eyes glistening. He looked down at Rose and Lily, who were both oblivious to the importance of the moment, their small hands reaching out to each other. "We did it," Karen whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Alexander looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "We did it," he echoed, his voice thick. They left the courtroom, stepping into the sunlight outside. Karen held Rose while Alexander carried Lily, both of them smiling, their hearts filled with a sense of completeness. They were a family, officially, legally, but more importantly, emotionally. That evening they celebrated quietly at home. Alexander cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish that Karen had taught him how to make. The twins were in their high chairs, giggling as Alexander made silly faces at them while stirring the sauce. Karen watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with love and contentment. After dinner, they put the girls to bed, Alexander tucking them in, his heart swelling as he watched their tiny faces, their soft breaths filling the room. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to each of their foreheads. "Good night, my girls," he whispered. "Daddy loves you." Karen stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears as she watched him. When he turned, she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him, holding him close. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For loving them, for loving us." Alexander held her tightly, his heart full. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "This is everything I've ever wanted." Days turned into weeks, and the new rhythm of their lives began to feel natural. Alexander found himself falling more and more in love with his daughters each day. He loved the way their eyes lit up when they saw him, the way they reached for him, the way they giggled when he made funny faces or picked them up. One evening as they sat in the living room, Karen looked at Alexander, a soft smile on her face. "You know," she said, her voice teasing, "I think you're actually pretty good at this dad thing." Alexander laughed, shaking his head. "I'm learning," he said, "but I have a pretty amazing teacher." Karen smiled, her eyes softening. "We're doing this, aren't we? We're really a family." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with love. "We are, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." They sat there, the twins playing on the floor in front of them, the soft light of the evening casting a warm glow over the room. Alexander looked around, his heart filled with a sense of peace and fulfillment. He had spent so much of his life chasing after success, after power. But now, sitting here, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, he realized that this was what truly mattered. This was his legacy, not the businesses he had built, not the wealth he had accumulated, but the family he had chosen, the love he had found. He looked at Karen, his eyes meeting hers, and he smiled. "I love you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Karen smiled back, her eyes glistening with tears. "I love you too." And in that moment, Alexander knew that he had everything he had ever wanted. A family, a home, a love that was real and true. He leaned over, pulling Karen into a gentle kiss, his heart swelling with love and hope for the future. Because no matter what challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. A year had gone by since that chaotic, life-altering night in the hospital when Rose and Lily were born. The townhouse had fully transformed into a home that resonated with laughter, soft cries, and the tiny but powerful presence of two little girls growing up. Today was an important milestone. It was Rose and Lily's first birthday. Alexander woke up early that morning, feeling the excitement buzzing in his chest. He quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake Karen, who was still fast asleep. He tiptoed into the nursery, where the twins were just beginning to stir, their little hands and feet wiggling beneath their blankets. He leaned over each crib, giving Rose and Lily a gentle kiss on their foreheads. "Good morning, my birthday girls," he whispered, his voice filled with love. "Today's a big day." He carefully scooped each of them up, holding one in each arm. They blinked up at him, still half asleep, but slowly breaking into wide, toothless grins. Their tiny hands reached up to touch his face, and Alexander couldn't help the surge of love that filled him. He never thought he could feel this much joy from such a small gesture, but here he was, completely captivated by his daughters. He took them downstairs, where balloons filled the living room, and a banner that read, "Happy First Birthday Rose and Lily," hung over the fireplace. He and Karen had spent the previous night decorating after the girls had gone to bed. It was a simple setup, but it was filled with love, and that was what mattered. Karen joined them not long after, yawning as she stepped into the living room. She paused when she saw Alexander with the twins, surrounded by the decorations, a wide smile spreading across her face. "Good morning, loves," she said, her voice soft. She walked over to them, pressing a kiss to Alexander's cheek, and then to each of the girls. "Happy birthday, my sweet little ones." The morning was spent in the cozy comfort of their home. Karen made pancakes, which Rose and Lily ate, or rather played with, in their high chairs, their little faces covered in sticky syrup. Alexander couldn't help but laugh, taking pictures of the mess they made, knowing that these moments were the ones he would treasure forever. By noon, their friends started arriving. It was a small gathering, just a few close friends and neighbors, as well as some of Karen's colleagues from the school. Alexander's sister Charlotte also made her way in, a soft smile on her face as she carried a beautifully wrapped present. "Where are my favorite nieces?" she called out as she entered the living room. Karen waved her over, smiling. "Right here. They're a little sticky, though." Charlotte laughed, leaning over to give each of the girls a kiss. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes warm. "They're getting so big," she said. "You must be so proud." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling. "I am, more than I can say." The party was simple but perfect. There was a cake, a small one for the girls and a larger one for everyone else. Karen helped Rose and Lily each dig into their tiny cake, their hands covered in frosting, their laughter filling the room as they smashed it between their fingers. Alexander stood by, snapping pictures, his heart full as he watched his family. When it came time to open presents, the twins were more interested in the wrapping paper than the actual gifts, which made everyone laugh. The room was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, and Alexander found himself stepping back for a moment, just to take it all in. He looked around at the people gathered, friends, family, neighbors, all of them here to celebrate this moment with him, with Karen, and with the girls. It wasn't the kind of grand celebration he used to envision for important milestones. There were no big venues, no extravagant displays of wealth. But as he watched Karen laugh with Charlotte, as he saw his daughters giggling with their new toys. He knew that this was better, more meaningful than anything money could buy. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the house had settled back into a peaceful quiet, Alexander sat on the couch, holding Rose while Karen held Lily. The girls were both tired, their eyes heavy as they snuggled against their parents. Karen looked over at Alexander, her eyes soft, her voice filled with emotion. "Today was perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." He looked back at her, his heart swelling with love. "No, thank you. For everything. For giving me this." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening. "You've earned it, Alexander. You've been here every step of the way." He nodded, his eyes falling to Rose, who was fast asleep in his arms. He gently stroked her hair, his heart filled with a love so deep it almost overwhelmed him. He looked up at Karen, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never been happier. I didn't even know this was what I needed until I found you." Karen leaned over, pressing her forehead to his, her eyes closing. "I love you, Alexander, more than I ever thought I could." "I love you too," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. They sat there for a while, holding their daughters, the room bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. It was a moment of pure peace, a moment where nothing else mattered but the love they shared. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander continued to embrace his new role. He no longer spent his nights in meetings or working late at the office. He spent them at home with Karen and the girls, reading bedtime stories, giving baths, and simply being present. He found joy in the small things, in the way Rose and Lily would crawl to him when he got home, in the way they laughed when he made funny faces, in the way Karen would look at him, her eyes filled with love. One evening, as they sat together in the backyard, watching the girls toddle around on wobbly legs, Karen turned to him, her eyes soft. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I used to think that the only kind of happiness I could have was the one I had before, with him. But now I realize that this is a different kind of happiness, and it's just as good, maybe even better." Alexander looked at her, his heart swelling. He reached over, taking her hand in his. "I used to think that I had everything I needed," he said, his voice quiet. "But I didn't know what I was missing until I found you, until I found them." Karen smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" He nodded, his gaze drifting to the girls, who were both giggling as they tried to chase a butterfly that had landed in the grass. "We have, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Karen leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Neither would I." The year continued to unfold, and with it came new challenges and new joys. The twins took their first steps, said their first words, and with every milestone, Alexander found himself falling more in love with his family. There were hard days, days when the girls wouldn't stop crying, when the exhaustion felt overwhelming. But those moments were outweighed by the good, the laughter, the cuddles, the moments of pure love. Alexander's business continued, but it was no longer the center of his life. He had found something far more important, something that gave his life meaning in a way that no amount of money or power ever could. He had found a family, a real, loving, imperfect family, and that was worth more to him than anything else. One night, as he stood in the nursery, watching Rose and Lily sleep, Karen came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with love. "They're everything," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Karen nodded, resting her head against his back. "They are, and so are you." Alexander turned, pulling her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I love you too," Karen replied, her voice soft. And in that moment, standing there, holding the woman he loved, watching over their daughters, Alexander knew that he had everything he had ever wanted. He had a family, he had love, and he was finally at peace. Because he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that was all that mattered.